Okay, I think we're a little bit light on our attendees, but I assume more people are going to trickle in. I want to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions, which I hope will be pretty active. If you haven't joined us before, my name is Derek Fung. I am your host for this quarter seminar series. Again, I want to acknowledge the generous support of the Bill Lane Center, Woods Institute, as well as Stanford Sustainability Data Science. If you, again, are joining us for the first time or have missed some of the seminar series, they are, for the most part, being recorded. Well, they are being recorded. And with permission of the speakers and their organizations, we are releasing those recordings. So if you want to catch up on any of the prior weeks, drop me an email at the email there. You see dfong@stanford.edu. I'd be happy to make the recordings available to you so you get more of a complete picture of what we've been talking about this quarter. There will be an exception or two to that at the end of the quarter. A couple of our speakers are trying to get clearance with their employers or organizations who are concerned perhaps about some legal issues about whether they say things truthfully or not. So stay tuned on that. And for the most part, these things are recorded. So if you missed something, be happy to provide the recording to you of the video. And then I'm going to start spinning up my marketing. And today's my first plea. Again, we have a small crowd here, but if people are listening to the recording, I direct the Big Earth Hackathon Wildland Fire Challenge, which is next quarter. Hoping a lot of students will sign up, but more importantly, maybe people in the audience would be interested in not just participating as students, but actually in providing project ideas. So if you have some ideas that you think would be beneficial for students to, with their creativity and intelligence, to explore during the spring quarter, drop me an email as well. I can set up a Zoom call or an in-person meeting with you to discuss your interest and maybe pose that as a project idea to the participants. With that being said, I want to give enough time to Mary, who's an awesome speaker and just a great colleague. I'm so pleased to have Dr. Mary Prunicki as today's speaker. She is the director of the Air Pollution and Health Research at the Sean Parker Center for Allergy Research at Stanford. Dr. Prunicki received her PhD from Northwestern University and her MD from Southern Illinois University. She leads a whole host of studies which investigate the impact of air pollution and wildfires on immune health. Her general goal is to use the research findings in those areas to both educate and shape policy. Again, I've known Mary, I guess, for maybe 5 years now, 6 years. And I just think she brings an incredible sense of passion, but also compassion to what she studies, especially looking at the effects of wildfire smoke on different populations and different regions. Today, she's going to speak to us about some of those connections, the connections between climate change, wildfire smoke, and human health. And I almost guarantee you will just be enthralled by what she has to share and hopefully have some questions to ask her as you think about these things and how they relate to what you understand and might be interested in learning about yourself. With that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over the controls to Mary. Thanks for being here with us, Mary. And I know you're really busy, so I especially appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Derek, for that really nice introduction. I don't think I get to deserve it, but I'm going to share my slides. But I wasn't quite sure what to focus on. There's lots you could focus on, so I'm fine as we go slide to slide. If people have questions, or you want to veer off in a different direction, so just give me 1 second.
Yeah, and I'll help moderate. If you're really shy, which I hope people aren't too shy, but if you're shy, that's okay. Pop something into the chat and I'll get Mary's attention if she's in the middle of speaking or something.
Yeah,
But
I'm not
you
good
also,
with watching the chat. That's great.
yeah. And if you'd like to, you can, if you're a little bit slightly ambitious, you can, do the whole raise your hand thing on Zoom. But you can just speak up too as well. So we got a small enough thing. That's why we're doing this meeting format as opposed to webinar format. So this can be as engaging as possible, but I'm happy to moderate if that's what helps. Anyway, Mary, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So you can see my slides, I assume? Yes, okay. So we're going to talk today about, primarily wildfire smoke exposure and how it impacts your health, but in the context of climate change. If you're interested, we can also talk about the ways the other climate variables impact your health and how they interrelate to wildfires and air pollution. But overall, as we go through, I just think it's important to keep in mind that this is a global health crisis. The climate crisis is, been termed a health crisis. And even as I, research and look at the interactions between the different components of climate change and how it impacts your health, it's pretty overwhelming how there's a compounding effect. So this is just looking at respiratory health, but as you can see, there's lots of components to climate change that interact with each other and then have a subsequent impact on respiratory health. But we could also be talking about cardiovascular health, mental health, lots of areas where we know that there's a direct or indirect association with things that are happening with climate change. So just to look at a couple of these bubbles, something you may not be aware of, the pollen season is changing with climate change. The pollen season is getting longer, it's starting earlier, the pollen is becoming more allergenic due to some of the changes, in temperature and increases in carbon dioxide. That is a huge concern for not only respiratory health, people's allergies. It will have and is having a large impact on the global population. In addition, the pollen is being blown farther and into new areas because of the extreme weather conditions, such as the hurricanes and the windstorms. And so people are being exposed to new types of allergens. There's something you may not have heard of called thunderstorm asthma, and that is when during a thunderstorm the pollen actually rupture, and so the tiny particles are then inhaled, and it can cause a hyper responsiveness to someone who doesn't have asthma. And obviously, have asthma, you can have an exacerbation, and that it's been documented, people die from thunderstorm asthma. And this is just one way that climate change is going to be impacting our health and our life expectancy. So anyhow, we can come back to this. We can discuss this if you want to. From here on out, I'll focus more on air pollution and wildfires and how that is obviously impacting your health with climate change. But does anyone have any questions on this slide or any of these direct effects that you'd like to focus on? Okay, I'll keep going. This is just to show that, with the increases in extreme weather, whether we're talking about increases in temperature, or floods and droughts, storms, all of those things will have indirect effects, including increases in air pollution, problems with water pollution, a lot of the indirect effects. And then there hasn't been as much focus on demographics and more socio-demographic factors, but the reality is all of these things come and interplay into who is most impacted by climate change, especially in reference to their health. And in general, it is the lower income and middle income countries that are going to be more impacted and less able to mitigate the changes associated with climate change. Whoops, did it go off?
Yeah, we lost your screen share for some reason.
So you can see that. Okay, 1 second. Sorry about that. Let's try it again. Okay,
Here we go.
Got it?
We're good.
Okay. So this is a just a map from 2016, and it shows that children under the age 5, there's a significant portion living in an area where the air quality does not meet the World Health Organization guidelines. What you will find is that this problem has increased, and at this time, it's estimated that 99% of the global population lives in an area where the air quality does not meet World Health Organization standards. So, almost no one is escaping the problems with air quality and specifically wildfires that climate change is exacerbating. The next slide just shows that the amount of particulate matter that you're exposed to is directly correlated with life expectancy. So we know that if we're talking about wildfire smoke, about 80% is composed of particulate matter. The rest of the components, obviously vary, but a significant portion is particulate matter. And in some of the countries where the air quality is so poor that the PM 2.5 is way above the criteria, you can see that the loss of life expectancy, is up to 2 years. And this is from a few years ago, so I'm sure if this was regraphed, the relationship would even be steeper. But it's just something to keep in mind overall, just if we're talking about air pollution in general, exposure is directly related to life expectancy.
Hey, Mary, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Myself here? Yeah, just maybe you're going to get to this. I've heard you speak before. This general trend in this data set, right, doesn't discriminate in what the PM 2.5 is, right?
No.
Whether it's from wildfire smoke or something else. Can you comment on, is there just sort of a general sense of what this data represents versus what might be evolving with wildfire smoke? Or is is Niger, Egypt, or Bangladesh, for example, we're sort of flattening off, which would maybe give a perception I think is probably not correct, right? That, oh, okay, we just pollute more, it's not going to get any worse in 2 years.
Right.
But I'm guessing there's some nuances there, right, in terms of the type
Right.
of 2.5 affecting
Yeah.
people.
Right. So this graph was based on just typical air pollution, not necessarily wildfire producing PM 2.5. There's research, ongoing that suggests that wildfire PM 2.5 is more toxic than typical air pollution PM 2.5. But the thing to keep in mind is the composition of the particulate matter varies with what's being burned or what's producing it. And so my guess is that since in the past 5 years we've had a lot more wildfires globally, that this curve would be steeper. Does that address what you were?
Yes, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
And this is just, in case you haven't had it explained before, the size of the particle determines how far it will travel into your respiratory tract and whether or not it is small enough to go all the way down to the base of your lungs and cross over into your bloodstream. So this is just kind of a nice graphic showing that, things like some of the larger things, pollen and spores, which we can talk about, sand, are a bit larger and perhaps will not make it all the way down into the alveoli. Whereas, gases, obviously viruses, the small particulate matter is small enough to go all the way down, cross over into the bloodstream, and then it can go, wherever it would like, basically, in the body. I don't have a slide talking about the problem with spores, but there is a problem with climate change and increasing, especially of fungal spores. And there's been, a couple different studies. One, they took, I'm blanking on the name, the little things that fly by themselves. They're not helicopters, but they're
Drones?
drones. So they took drones and they went through, it was a prescribed burn actually, and collected the smoke and analyzed it, and they found an increase in fungal spores. And we know that, there's been problems with fungal spores, coccidioidomycosis in the Central Valley. I think it was in the 70s or 80s. There was a huge outbreak. And so this is a concern with climate change too, with the increase in dust storms and with the change in the amount of flooding versus drought. This is just another area, especially if we're talking about respiratory impacts that climate change is having. This is just an overview. We're not going to go through all of this, but there are many organ systems that we know that wildfire smoke exposure is associated with poor outcomes or increases in biomarkers suggesting that there will be increased inflammation. If you start on the left, the immune system, that's kind of where our lab focuses. And I'll show you some slides in a little bit that exposure to smoke will increase inflammatory markers in the blood. It will cause, air pollution in general, and there's limited data right now on wildfire smoke will cause epigenetic changes in your DNA. So it's not a mutation in your DNA, but it's an up or down regulation in the functioning of it. I see Marshall's on here. There's more and more known about the impact of wildfire smoke on birth outcomes. There have been studies, the 2018 fires, it was shown that there's an increase in clinic visits for eczema and itching in various populations, even around in the San Francisco area. Airways, that's where we have the most data showing that exposure to smoke does impact the respiratory system. The cardiovascular system, we'll talk about in a minute, but we do know it's associated with heart attacks, arrhythmias, sudden cardiac death. The GI system is an interesting area. People are looking at inflammation in the gut, and also the lining of the gut, the epithelial barrier, and the degree of tightness between the cells. And we know that that's associated, kind of a leaky gut is associated with increasing exposure to pollutants. And then there's even central nervous system impacts. There's more research coming out that there are mental health related issues associated with wildfire smoke exposure. We're going to be publishing some of that data soon. We know there's increases in stroke. The PTSD, most of the data on that is looking at people who are directly exposed to a fire. Maybe they had an evacuation and they have increases in post-traumatic stress disorder. But what we're finding now, though, is the exposure to the smoke itself will cause increases in mental health related issues. And then increase in early Alzheimer's disease. We know that air pollution in general is associated with that. And so it makes sense that the wildfire smoke will also cause issues. So just a really brief overview. We know from many studies that there are respiratory effects when a population is exposed to wildfire smoke. We know that there will be increases in emergency room visits for asthma asthma exacerbations, COPD exacerbations, and increases in emergency room visits for acute bronchitis and pneumonia. And in general, people find that about, a 10 micron per cubic meter increase in PM2.5 is associated with, roughly, 8 to 10% increase in admissions, if you were to kind of make a generalization. For cardiovascular health effects, there are studies, showing that there definitely are cardiovascular effects when you're exposed to the smoke. The literature has not been quite as robust as the respiratory literature for a variety of reasons. In general, though, we know that there are increases in, arrhythmias, heart attacks, strokes. I'm going to go through quickly one paper showing this. And there's various mechanisms associated with why this happens, mechanistically. And again, a 10 unit increase in PM2.5 is associated with approximately a 10 to 20% increase in mortality. There's a study by Wetstein that looked at all the fires in California in 2015, and then looked at the incidence of cardiovascular and respiratory outcomes showing up in the emergency room. And what he showed was that there is an increase depending, on the level of smoke and also which outcome you're looking at. If you look at the blue, you'll notice those are all slightly higher, whether you're looking at all-cause cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, or respiratory. The blue are the elderly, so age 65 and older. And so they're obviously one of the vulnerable populations that we have to consider when talking about exposure to the wildfire smoke. Any questions so far about respiratory or cardiovascular health impacts from the smoke?
Yeah, Mary, I guess I'll chime in.
Okay.
Is there, it's not quite, you might think it's not relevant, but is there a data set for then children? So this is all adults. I assume this is all 18 above. There's
Yeah.
obviously asthma, right? So I'm not sure they have stuff on cardiovascular disease for a youth, but is there another spot to put in the curve that may go? I'm speculating. Does it go back up, right, for the younger population, right? It seems like it's getting worse as you get older, but you spoke earlier to the fact that when you're young, it's really a problem.
So it's really a problem with the respiratory system. And there's lots of reasons for that, just anatomically. The young are more susceptible because of their narrowed airways, their lungs are not as developed, and they tend, if they're outside, they tend to have be more active, have higher metabolism. So when we're talking about the respiratory system, the young definitely are one of the big vulnerable populations. When we're talking about cardiovascular, though, it's I'm not aware of any studies showing that association, and it's because a young child, unless they have some type of pre-existing cardiac condition, is able to kind of mediate the smoke. So I don't know if anybody else knows of any studies. Just medically, it makes sense that you're not going to see young kids having cardiovascular issues and going into an arrhythmia or things like that, having a stroke in a normal, healthy, small child, but you certainly will have respiratory outcomes.
That makes sense. Thank you, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Mary, this is Marshall. We've got some data on that actually that Sam Hefneal in our group has been leading. I'll show a little bit of it next week.
Okay.
For kids, yeah.
For heart.
Very nice.
No, sorry, on the respiratory side. Yeah,
oh, okay,
I think what
good.
you just said about cardiovascular makes sense. Yeah, on the respiratory side, using ED visits in California.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I was wondering if you're going to tell me that there's cardiovascular data. I would be surprised, but
no, I don't think
I
we
guess
see
you never
that.
know.
I'll confirm with Sam, but no, I think you're right.
Okay. And then I put this study in here because, one of the vulnerable populations are obviously outdoor workers, and then especially, firefighters exposed to the smoke. And we know that for firefighters, the number one cause of death in a firefighter is cancer. It is not exposure, it's not on the job, related incidents. And, there's a direct association between lung cancer and also in this study, they looked at cardiovascular mortality in relation to how much particulate matter they're being exposed to. And so, that's one area of interest for us because obviously the immune system is involved in the development of cancer. At what point with smoke exposure do you kind of pass that point of having issues with the smoke to becoming more at risk for, it's not just lung cancer, there's various cancers that firefighters are at increased risk of getting. And then I put this study in here, it was from 2021. And the reason I thought it was important is because it showed that exposure, if a community is exposed to the smoke, they will be more susceptible to infection. So obviously with COVID-19, that's a huge concern. And so a group out of Harvard analyzed exposure to wildfires in 2020 and looked at the number of cases of COVID and also the number of deaths from COVID, and found a relationship between the level of PM 2.5 and the number of cases and the number of deaths. And I know you can't read it, but what's listed are the various counties in the West, in California, Oregon, Washington. And this is consistent from studies that have already been done with influenza, so another type of infection. If a community is exposed to wildfire smoke, a few months later, when it's influenza season, it will, the population will be more susceptible and there'll be increased deaths from influenza. And, I think there's been papers showing the association between COVID in general and air pollution. There's been several of those, but this is the only one that I know of looking at COVID and exposure to wildfire smoke. And this is interesting. If we look at studies, using a mouse model, this came out last year. And what they did is they tried burning various types of trees, exposing the smoke to mice. Then they look at the blood and the lung tissue in the mouse, and they do, it's called transcriptomics. They look at the RNA expression and see basically which trees are, at least to mice, most toxic. And obviously the thinking is that this will help inform public health for humans. And so what they found was that flaming peat, eucalyptus, and smoldering eucalyptus caused the most changes in the RNA transcripts, whereas the smoldering red oak and smoldering peat caused the least changes. And so, the thought is that it's less toxic. Those types of trees are less toxic. What would really be interesting is if they added in things that get burned in a structure fire, because, we feel that when a person is also inhaling maybe synthetics in the home that are being brought up into the smoke, or chemicals that are being burned, that is going to be even more toxic to human health. So I'm kind of hoping that they're going to repeat this, maybe looking at other types of structure fire burns.
Mary, can I ask a question about this?
Mhm.
Are these sort of types of studies? How, like, I just don't know anything about this. Is any change bad? And how do we think about, like, are the magnitudes interpretable? Like, is this a big enough change to be bad? Like, how do we think about effect sizes here, or even direction of effect?
I don't know that we know the answer to that. I'm not aware of a lot of studies like this. Obviously we try to do it in humans, but that's obviously you can't do these types of exposures.
Right.
So I don't think that they looked at the long-term health of the mouse, but the fact that exposure to the smoke did cause changes in RNA transcription is concerning. I honestly don't know how much we can interpret that as relating directly to human changes. I know that's not very helpful, but I don't know that we know that answer.
Yeah, no, thanks.
And so what I was going to just talk briefly about a couple studies that have come out of our lab looking at the exposure to smoke. And there was one retrospective study that looked at teenagers in Fresno. They were 60 miles away from Yosemite, where there was a wildfire going on. And those subjects were compared to controls, so teenagers that weren't exposed to the smoke. And what we found, and we drew their blood, and then we looked at the biomarkers in the blood, proteins, and what we found is that there was an increase in both IL-1 beta and CRP. So IL-1 beta is known to be part of the inflammatory pathway. It's one of the key biomarkers, and CRP stands for C-reactive protein. It's not specific, neither one of these are specific to exposure to the smoke, but they do indicate a level of inflammation. And in general, we know with our health, chronic inflammation is certainly not good. We don't know in a teenager who's exhibits subclinical changes in their inflammatory markers, how that translates, to their adult health. The research isn't there. And so, one thought though is that if you have these kids being exposed, because Fresno typically gets, some of the smoke every year from the wildfires. If you have kids, periodically exposed to the smoke, and there's subclinical changes in their inflammatory markers, is that laying the foundation for adult chronic disease? And we don't have that answer. And the other study I'll just briefly talk about is the fires of 2020 here in the Bay Area. We had baseline blood collected on a lot of people. And when the fires hit, due to COVID, which obviously we weren't expecting, we weren't able to get many to come back in and be able to give a blood draw. So this is a rather small study because we wanted both baseline and post-exposure smoke markers. These people were not outdoor workers, they were indoor workers. Some of them wore masks going to and from their building, some of them didn't, but most did wear a mask for reasons of COVID, if nothing else. And this is just showing you the difference in the air quality between the baseline blood draw and then the blood draw during the fires. Most of the the blood was drawn after the fires had been going on for 2 weeks. And so obviously there was enough exposure. And so we took the blood and we took the plasma and we ran different panels of biomarkers. And a lot of panels were ran because we really don't know. It was more exploratory what in this general population, what types of changes in biomarkers we're going to find. But lo and behold, there were differences that were significant, even in this small sample size of, I believe, 15. The red dot represents a significant inverse relationship with the smoke exposure, but the blue dots indicate significant upregulation associated with smoke exposure. A lot of these markers are obviously associated with inflammatory pathways, and we're still trying to figure out if we're how many pathways we're dealing with these markers. And we're doing follow-up studies actually in firefighters, trying to determine, what happens on a, immune level with exposure to the smoke.
Mary, can I ask a dumb question here?
No, I'm sure it's not dumb.
No, it's quite dumb. So all these different things in blue, these all are like interpretable. These are inflammatory markers that are then something about that are linked to some downstream thing, or they're
how do you
think about the effects?
Yeah, so some of them we know are linked. Like my screen is pretty small. I think it's IL-18 is one of them. One of the interesting things of you see GZMB, there's these things called the granzymes. We didn't know that would be associated with smoke exposure. So we don't really know how all of these markers directly tie into the smoke exposure. We think that we're dealing with more than one pathway. It's not just one inflammatory pathway. And we are doing follow-up studies. Some of the other things, VWF is von Willebrand factor. So that has to do with more hemodynamics, blood clotting and things like that. So, we're trying to figure out, because we know that, you do see increases in stroke with wildfire smoke exposure. You see changes, you see increases in arrhythmias and heart attacks and sudden cardiac death. So we do not have it nicely laid out marker for marker, which one is contributing to which type of outcome yet. We're trying, but hopefully the firefighter data will be more informative.
Got it. Another just dumb statistical question on that stuff. Are you, with these small samples and you're testing for a lot of stuff, are you guys worried about sort of false discovery here? Is there an easy, multiple hypothesis correct and do all the standard stuff?
Yeah, we for this we did I believe is a partial PLS partial least squares analysis. I believe is what we used on this one. And yes, we do have to worry about multiple hypothesis testing. They determined a cutoff had to be greater than a 10% change to reach statistical significance. You could argue, because there were a lot of panels run, that maybe that's not stringent enough. And some of our current work, we're doing targeted analysis, so hopefully we won't have that problem.
Cool, thanks.
This is just a kind of a nice summary slide of all the different toxins that you can have in the smoke. Some things we haven't talked about are things like heavy metals. Our lab is looking at the association with heavy metal levels with immune cells and the cytokines in the blood. You can have things like PAH, which is polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are cancer causing. Volatile organic compounds, just there can be so many different compounds, hundreds within the smoke. But we do know that in general, none of this is healthy to breathe. Does anyone have any questions about this slide? I guess we didn't really talk about micro and nanoplastics, but then that's another area that's, pretty new area of research. But that can also be part of what you inhale, especially when you're talking about structure fires. And here we quote a really good paper. Wildfire smoke is unraveling decades of air quality gains. So we know that the smoke is really hurting our air quality. There does not seem to be any real solutions, I guess we can talk about this, in sight to try to maintain a better air quality globally. And we could also talk about indoor air quality, which is another area that globally is quite a problem. Even the way that people cook their meals, cook stoves, there's still a problem globally with the amount of air pollution that emits, and even here in the States with the leakage of the methane. So in this last slide, it just kind of summarizes some of the pollutants that you are exposed to with wildfire smoke, some of the health outcomes. We haven't really talked too much about the at-risk group, but obviously pregnant women, the very young and the very old, those with pre-existing conditions, the underserved, such as the homeless, and then outdoor workers. That's not on here, but obviously they're more at risk. And I think, whenever we talk about policies, we need to keep these at-risk groups in mind when we're coming up with ways to reduce exposures. So those are all the slides I have. I'll leave it on here in case people want to talk about different ways to reduce exposures or anything about at-risk groups or anything else that you would like to discuss.
Mary, thank you for a great vision of what's going on, a very sobering vision of the health effects. And I'd like just to open the floor to questions. I have several myself, but I usually can reach out to Mary on my own. So as usual, I'll open it up to the audience. Anyone have any questions or comments? Everyone's speechless or just really depressed.
Depressed.
Hi, I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Ming Hao. I'm a postdoc with Marshall's group. So one thing I was wondering if you can talk a little more about is the long-term impacts of wildfire. And I guess one thing is we think of them as the more emerging environmental risk. So is this because sort of the time horizon is not long enough, so there hasn't been enough long-term studies? Or I guess, is there already some kind of long-term study there? And if not, should our predictions be wildfire smoke is worse than other sources of pollution for like cancer risk, because we may expect there are more PAH concentrations, things like that are associated with smoke compared to like other sources of particulate matters?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you are, next to some type of industry putting out, things into the air that they shouldn't be, when we talk about the smoke, it can be cancer-causing agents, it can be heavy metals, which we know kind of accumulate in your body, often in different organs like the bone, and it stays there, and it is associated with cancer risk. And so I think right now the studies are becoming better at delineating the differences in the smoke and then trying to compare that to the health outcomes, realizing that not all smoke is created equal. We didn't talk about the aging of the smoke. So as the smoke ages, it produces more free radicals, which is potentially more toxic to humans. As far as long-term studies, I guess you'd have to define long-term, but there aren't a lot. In the general population, like in our lab, we have 2 time points. That's nothing. We need to be looking, a decade out. There was a paper that came out of Canada recently that associated, I believe it was wildfire. I have to double check. I think it was wildfire smoke with cancer rates. But there aren't a lot of studies. There's some small studies with the firefighters. But with the firefighters, there aren't a lot of mechanistic studies to actually understand what's going on in the body with the smoke exposure. So I don't know if that's helpful, but long-term studies are definitely lacking.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks for the question, Ming-Hao. Anyone else have a question or comment? We're almost at time. Well, Mary, I want to end with, Marshall, you had a question.
Oh, sure. I mean, I have a ton. Keep going, but I can follow up with Mary. Mary, I wonder if you would just I know you all have so much in the field, and I wondered if you have the sort of how to reduce exposures here. Do you have things in the field sort of evaluating some of these approaches, or how are you all thinking about evaluation there?
We're working on maybe doing some air purifier type studies, but mainly, most recently, been working with the firefighters. They're hard to do. They're very hard to do. We have an interest in looking at the difference in health outcomes being exposed to a wildfire versus a prescribed burn, and really showing, hopefully, that prescribed burn is much less toxic and much less invasive to your health, in the hopes that we have something very concrete to be able to base recommendations on. The air purifier studies, I mean, there's air purifier studies out there. They're very difficult to do. And then when you're talking about wildfire smoke exposure, there's obviously a problem with knowing where it's going to happen and when. So yeah, I mean, within the lab, we're focusing on prescribed burns and wildfires. We're looking more interested in the relationship with cancer, and then associating it with the actual components of the smoke. Those are the major studies going on right now.
Cool, thanks.
Well, that's great. Thanks for the question, Marshall, because that's you actually were more clear or specific than I was going to ask. I was going to ask the global question of, like, with this sobering information you presented, Mary, right? What can we do, right? We obviously want to limit large wildfires and things like that, but I guess the area of research, right, is air purifiers and maybe masks, and what we suggest to people to do. If you can't change climate change, we can reduce it, but we're going to have wildfires to live with in the future. Is your suggestion, at least right now, without knowing any data, to try to clean the air up year-round and distribute masks when wildfires happen and encourage people to wear them? Is that at least where we are in 2023 without knowing a lot more information?
That doesn't sound very good, but yes, I think that's where we're at. I mean,
yeah, just
globally,
honest look, right? I mean, this is
globally, the concern is that the people that are going to be the most impacted by climate change in terms of their health are going to be the least able to do those things, like put on a mask and have an air purifier. And so I think obviously a concern is that, I mean, there's already been, I forget the number, a huge amount of people that have already from climate change had to migrate. And with migration, there becomes issues with food supply and other health, impacts along the way. So I think a huge concern is that, maybe the more well-off countries can come up with some technology, but what about those who are not able to support that type of technology?
Yeah, I'm with you, and hope someone can come up with a solution here, because that's a major problem. But thank you for your time today, Mary. Thank you for everyone that's in attendance. Again, spread the word. About 4 more great weeks. Marshall's going to be speaking with us next week. So you enjoyed Mary today. I'm sure you'll enjoy Marshall on some of his insights looking at smoke pollution. We've got a great lineup. Spread the word, and we'll see you again next week. Have a great week, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you.